समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.
While we talk about trade, we will talk about trade in more detail in a day or two. We have to understand where we were, where we have reached, and what is the reason I say that in the India-US relationship, this is the Trump era, which might be much more prone to turbulence than what we've seen in the past. But there's always been turbulence, and at the same time, many periods of great comfort, good flying in the India-US relationship. Stay with me as I tell you the story of 5 strategic shifts that brought India closer to the US until this Trump disruption that we are dealing with now. In fact, when Obama came gracing the Republic Day parade in 2015, I had noted in a national interest that this will be the first time an American leader had been accorded that honor. Through our history, America had been a distant power we reached out to at junctures of desperate need. During the 1962 debacle, for example, Nehru wrote a letter to Kennedy asking for weapons, asking for fighter planes also, and plenty of US arms and training were also made available to India. It was in Nehru's last years that Americans even set up a military mission in New Delhi. That's not something that people remember even institutionally. And that was a military mission led by a full 2-star general in Delhi, but it was kept below the radar. Then Nehru died, Kennedy was assassinated, and that initiative or that outreach or that warmth sort of got dissipated. We were not at the same time, while we were seeking help with the Americans, we were not calling each other strategic allies. Pakistan was still America's strategic ally because Pakistan was a member of American security organizations, regional security organizations. The relationship between India and the US declined after the 1965 war with Pakistan, but we were back on friendly terms with PL 480, which was named for food aid. Once a series of droughts hit India, droughts had started in 64, 65, as we mentioned earlier, was a year of negative economic growth, negative by 2.6%. It was the toughest time for India. I've stood in ration queues as a kid, as a proxy for my mom those days. If the first half of the 1960s brought us American armaments and training, in 1965, American ships arrived at our ports laden with wheat. Then followed another freeze between 1969 and 1971. 1969 is when Mrs. Gandhi made her hard shift to the left. It was impossible in this period for a government to survive by inviting the US President as Republic Day chief guest. It was too risky in decades when anti-Americanism was the bedrock of non-alignment and thereby our foreign policy. That honor, accordingly, was reserved for non-aligned heads of state, many third world dictators, and generally the anti-American Cold War gang. In the 4 decades, I am using this, in fact, to give you the answer to the larger question as to how the India-US relationship has progressed through history. This is a proxy. Republic Day guests is a proxy for how India's foreign policy or India's big power relations have progressed over time. In the 4 decades between 1950 and 1990, only 3 US presidents visited India. That included Richard Nixon's one-day visit in 1969, which actually was a transit halt. After Bill Clinton came in 2000, in the Vajpayee era, both his successors, that is Bush and Obama, have showcased their India visits, and Obama traveled to India twice in his presidency. And then Donald Trump came to India as well in February 2020. Besides the fact that over the years, no American was ever given that honor, The Soviets and other Eastern Bloc / non-aligned strongmen were regular present. Some like Marshal Tito of former Yugoslavia enjoying multiple appearances, 1968-74, non-aligned movement, remember? They were the leaders of the then favored Afro-Asian nations, Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, Mobutu of Zaire, now Democratic Republic of Congo, that we spoke about in a full Katak letter the other day, about the war over the resources of DRC. It's Chinese in 1958, that is Marshal Ye Jianying, who was the PLA chief then. He was the PLA chief. He was the chief guest in 1958. 1959, our first clashes took place. Even two Pakistanis, Malik Ghulam Muhammad, Governor General of Pakistan in 1955, and surprise of surprises, Rana Abdul Hamid in 1965. He was Pakistan's Food and Agriculture Minister. And the idea with the Shastri government, you can't blame Nehru for this. The idea with the Shastri government was that this might help stabilize the situation, the relationship with Pakistan. He was the Republic Day chief guest in 1965. So the same Indian Armed Forces who marched down what used to be Rajpath, then saluting the Salami Manch with the Pakistani Food and Agriculture Minister Rana Abdul Hamid as the chief guest, were fighting a full-fledged war with the Pakistanis later in the same year. That was the 22-day war of attrition in September that year. We were willing to welcome leaders of China and Pakistan, even as we fought with them over territory and ideology, but not those of the US and most other Western powers with whom we argued over ideology. If you scan history, the only Western leader, at least in a manner of speaking, who was invited during this entire period was Queen Elizabeth II in 1961, when Nehru's Raj nostalgia was still on. A British Prime Minister had to wait till 1993. It was John Major then. Why am I telling you all this? I'm telling you all this that India's relationship with America has changed dramatically in the last decades. And when you see what's going on right now, you have to keep all of that in perspective. Plus, you will also have to see the many downturns that we had. The biggest downturn was between 1971-72. That is when the Americans, Kissinger and Nixon, made their famous or infamous in history tilt towards Pakistan because they wanted to reach out to China. And that's what has left us Indians, multiple generations of Indians, with that awful memory of USS Enterprise, the 7th Fleet led by the USS Enterprise sailing towards the Bay of Bengal. Now, are we facing the same moment now? I've seen some anger in the social media, people saying, oh, this is the return of the USS Enterprise. This is the return of the 7th Fleet. I would say, as I said earlier, keep your seatbelts fastened and see how this moves, because much water has flown from the rivers of the subcontinent into the Bay of Bengal since 1971. That's a metaphor for saying that much has changed between Indian-American relations since 1971, particularly since 1991, since India's economic reform started. And this is a very different of India. The size and the stature and the clout of this India is very different from what it might have been in 1971, even relative to the state of the world then. That's the reason I say that it's fascinating how merely running your eye over the list of chief guests over these decades gives you an unambiguous overview of Indian foreign policy's total anti-Western toxification. That's the reason anti-Americanism comes so naturally to us. It is our default mindset. We were happy to host dictators and despots who probably laughed at the idea of a liberal constitutional republic. You'd be surprised that Fidel Castro and Egypt's Nasser somehow missed out. However, the house where I've lived for nearly 4 decades now, it's right next to one of Delhi's widest avenues named after Nasser. That's a part of the ring road, outer ring road in Delhi. The only Westerners to occasionally make it were marginal. Spain and Greece, Spain even more than Greece, in many ways were seen to be anti-West in several ways until then. You will also notice the French bucking the trend. They have made that hallowed podium 5 times, more than any other nation besides Bhutan actually. I'm not able to fully decode a Westophobic establishment's Francophilia over these decades. and maybe someone wiser can enlighten us at some point of time. I can only guess that while being a NATO ally, France was seen to be a critic of America and definitely superior culturally, seen as such in India. And the special relationship with the French was again underlined last year in January 2024 when Biden, after seemingly having committed to coming on Republic Day, said no. That is when the Pannu Tamasha was going on. And then at the last moment, Macron agreed to come as the chief guest. That's a very special India-French connection, or India's French connection in a positive sense, not like the movie. And probably also because it was our only Western supplier of armaments starting in the 50s. And I suppose it did no harm that Indira Gandhi had learned French, but the French also made their first appearance only in 1976. A delicious reminder, it was the peak of the emergency and Mrs. Gandhi would have seen value in a Western republic's endorsement. No other Western country, definitely no other Western democracy would accept to send its chief executive as the chief guest of Republic Day in emergency era India. And of course, there were Kenneth Kaunda of Zambia and liberal democracies like Poland and Bulgaria, who were pretty much part of the Soviet bloc. In fact, the national interest, where I had put more such data, I will share a link with you. You can read more examples. All I would say is our choice of foreign friends to honor over the years makes an incredibly accurate index of how our worldview has evolved, or rather remained frozen through those decades. It's only with the beginning of reform in 1991 and the end of the Cold War that the list becomes more diverse, though reluctantly. Britain, South Korea, Japan, even Nursultan Nazarbayev of Kazakhstan made the cut, but America had to wait till 2015. That tells you a story. 2015, and that is all. So significant was the shift, the invitation to Obama as the Republic Day chief guest, as the first American chief guest, that I called it the fourth significant shift since the reform began in 1991. The first big shift was P.V. Narasimha Rao establishing full diplomatic relations with Israel in January 1992. It was a very, very brave and risky decision for a Congress Prime Minister, particularly a non-Gandhi, leading a minority government. But the old fox had covered himself as only he could. He announced his decision when Yasser Arafat was in New Delhi and talked him into endorsing the decision at his press conference. You should see a national interest. I wrote about that, headline Conscience and Cowardice. I will share a link with you. This shift was not so much about Israel or Palestine. This was basically to say that India was now moving away from its firm, frozen, anti-Western, non-aligned position. That's why I call it our first strategic shift. The second came under the next full-term Prime Minister, Atal Bihari Vajpayee. He became the first Indian leader to hail America not merely as a strategic but as a natural ally. This is what unleashed a flurry of new engagement and quick US presidential visits. Vajpayee himself had maybe a generational gap and a personal chemistry gap with much younger American leaders Clinton and Bush, but he was well served by the team of Jaswant Singh, Brajesh Mishra and Yashwant Sinha, who not only believed in this continuing shift but also were its architects. It helped the subcontinent prevent war twice, in 1999 Kargil and 2002 after the Parliament attack. The re-education of the Indian mind on how old Cold War foes could now be allies had well and truly begun. That is under threat right now, and the fault lies with Donald Trump. The third shift came again under a Congress Prime Minister leading an unapologetically left-centrist coalition, with Manmohan Singh risking his government on the nuclear deal. And this was despite grave doubts within his party, from Sonia to Arjun Singh to Salman Khurshid. He chose losing the left allies and saw the deal through to its conclusion. I have always maintained that the nuclear deal was not really about energy, that was a nicer wrapping energy. Essentially, it was a strategic shift in the same way India saw the new world and now related to it. Modi's invitation to Obama as the Republic Day chief guest marked a fourth shift. Getting Obama at Republic Day, therefore, wasn't just another selfie moment. It completed a script that Rao began writing in January 1992. That is where I would come to the fifth shift. The fifth shift came under Narendra Modi. Narendra Modi then took that definition further. Not only did he repeatedly, first of all, he embraced the nuclear deal, which the BJP had voted against in parliament. Second, he repeatedly described this as an essential, natural, strategic alliance or partnership. And he built a good relationship with a series of American presidents: Obama, then Trump, then Biden, and then Trump to begin with. It's only now that this has hit a rock. This ship has hit some kind of a rock. It's not as if, like the Titanic, it has hit such a big iceberg that it has to go down. It's been rocked by something, and that situation needs watching with caution. We have to understand a few things. Trump said, for example, in his latest tweet that India is buying cheap Russian oil and selling it on open markets. First of all, a basic fact: India sells no crude on open markets. India is actually short of crude. India imports 88% of its need for petroleum. So how would it buy and sell any crude in open markets? That's nonsense, but that's the way Trump speaks. Trump also believes in shock and awe, and he does this shock and awe on social media. The second thing is, as the Indian spokesperson, MEA spokesperson, pointed out in a long, detailed statement, India only started buying this oil because a certain price band was fixed, that you can buy this at a particular price, which was lower than the global price, and it is adjusted to be kept lower than the global price. So, one, the Russians get less profit, less money for their oil, and second, so that this supply of Russian oil does not go away from global markets. Today, it will be about 20-25% of the global oil supply. If it goes out of the global markets, global oil prices will go up, and that's the reason we also saw this old statement from the US ambassador earlier, Eric Garcetti, and that's a video where he says that Americans wanted India to start buying this oil to keep global oil prices also in control, also within limits. So India says not guilty. We did it because you wanted us to do it, and we are not profiteering from it. That is the Indian answer. However, this situation is troublesome. I will quote Eshwar Prasad, Professor of Trade Policy and Economics from Cornell University, as quoted in Financial Times in a story by James Politi in Washington, D.C. and Andre Shipani in Delhi. He says, so much, and I quote, so much for the bromance between Modi and Trump and ostensibly close relationship between two budding geopolitical allies. And then he goes on to say, this is a tough and painful setback for India, which had come close to securing a phased trade deal and had been anticipating significant trade and investment benefits from being seen as a geopolitical ally of the US. I would, however, strike a note of caution, because this is the Trump way of doing things. He's spoken like this about many countries, and in the end either ended up having a deal, getting a deal, or sometimes continuing to build the pressure in the hope that he will get a better deal. All I would say in conclusion is, doesn't matter what the score is, what the asking rate is, this game is still on. There is turbulence, it will have your pulse racing. Keep that seatbelt on, but this will go a very long distance yet.